So before I dive right in, I'm going to sort of say a few words about definitions. I think all the talks that we've had today they're a testament to the sort of multiplicity of experiences that can fall under the genderqueer umbrella term. And really, for a number of reasons, I don't really want to pin myself down to any sort of really narrow, concrete definition of genderqueer. So really, the only concrete thing I want to say is I'm going to be considering those genderqueer identities that encompass some sort of rejection of the gender binary. So whether that's living outside, beyond, in between, some sort of aspect of the gender binary, that's what I'm going to be looking at. Like I say, number one, because there's just so many other experiences I couldn't possibly sort of proclaim to talk about them all. But number two, because there's actually not a one-to-one translation that I find satisfactory between English and French. So if I'm talking about genderqueer in English, the French experiences that I'm going to be sort of discussing kind of come under a lot of different terms in that language. So any sort of concrete definition that I'd come up with would just give rise to a whole host of other linguistic problems that I'm really looking to avoid. So Miranda Fricker defines her conception of hermeneutical injustice, as will I, through what she sees as a central case. So it's a true story of a young woman, Carmita Wood, who was working as an admin assistant at Cornell University in the 60s, 70s, and who found herself to be the wholly unwilling subject of some sexually motivated advances from one of the professors in her department. The stress of kind of maintaining cordial relations with him and his wife, who also worked in the department, led to some physical symptoms, and she was forced to quit her job after 8 years and take herself off to Florida for some rest and recuperation. When she returned, she tried to apply for unemployment benefit, but was refused after finding herself unable to explain her reasons for leaving her job after 8 years as anything other than personal. Her frustration led her to seek out female colleagues who all reported having similar experiences, and who were similarly frustrated by their inability to articulate exactly why this practice was making them uncomfortable, and therefore why these advances were something a little bit more sinister than sort of the harmless fun or the flirting or the compliments that they were usually labelled as. These discussions prompted the group to organise a speak out to raise awareness, but the group was kind of stumped when they realised they actually didn't have a name for this thing that they were supposed to be raising awareness of. After much furrowing of brows and discussion, they came up with the term sexual harassment, which was obviously the first step towards sort of fighting that sort of discrimination on legal grounds. Fricker argues then that this is an example of where there is a gap in the collective hermeneutical resource for social understanding. So where there should be a name for the distinctive social experience that affects one social type, in this case distinctive experience being sexual harassment, social type being women, there is nothing, there's a gap, there's a complete hole. But she avoids giving this injustice too general a definition by drawing attention to the fact that women's relative powerlessness in comparison to men at the time, in almost every field, contributes in an important way to our intuition that Carmita was the one who suffered an injustice, whereas her harasser, who was presumably victim to the same sort of gap in the hermeneutical resource, was not. So from there she develops the definition of hermeneutical injustice as being the injustice of having some aspect of one's social experience obscured from collective understanding owing to hermeneutical marginalisation, where in this case hermeneutical marginalisation is to be understood as some social type. So in this case, women were being excluded from the process of generating social meaning. Hermeneutical marginalisation, then, is a form of powerlessness, and hermeneutical injustice is the resultant injustice when someone who is hermeneutically marginalised in some way tries to make some aspect of their social experience intelligible to others or themselves, but finds themselves unable to. So in this way, hermeneutical injustice is not a constant state of being, it is just a name given to the case-by-case, moment-by-moment occurrences when someone is trying to make intelligible their experience but finds themselves without the resources to do so appropriately. So the questions I'm going to be concerning myself today with then are firstly, are genderqueer people in France hermeneutically marginalised? And secondly, does this hermeneutical marginalisation lead to some aspect of their social experience being obscured? Like I said earlier, I'm hoping to demonstrate an affirmative answer to both those questions, otherwise this presentation would be super short and vaguely pointless. So first I'm going to tackle hermeneutical marginalisation of non-binary people in France. Bearing in mind what I said earlier about there being no one-to-one translation of genderqueer in French, I'm going to be drawing from data that broadly talks about trans-identified people. And I'll assume that non-binary identified people fall under this category too. In fact, the 2011 survey of 187 trans respondents, which was done by a French trans activist research group based in Lyon, where they left an entirely open space for gender identity to be written in, identified 54 separate gender identities among the 187 respondents. So I'm going to be assuming, on the basis of that, that non-binary people will come under the general heading trans when there is only trans or not trans to choose from. So Fricker identifies powerlessness in women's unequal participation in practices which contribute to generating social meaning. So among these, she's talking about journalists, she's talking about academics, she's talking about lawyers, and she's talking about politicians. It would appear, kind of just on first common sense look, that genderqueer people are sorely underrepresented in these domains too. But to be sure, a study in 2007 of French trans-identified people found that 21% of them had already terminated their studies for citing reasons of gender-related harassment in the educational establishments of which they were part. So if we consider that terminating studies is actually something of a last resort, it's not something you just wake up and decide to do in the morning on the basis of a whim for absolutely no reason. It has huge repercussions for your further sort of educational and employment prospects and all the rest of it. So if we consider that, we might speculate then that there are more trans-identified people in France who are only barely participating in their educational establishments. One trans-identified student was quoted in a series of testimonials as saying that since the thought of finding themselves doing graceful pirouettes in front of everyone in PE class seemed to them their idea of absolute hell, they preferred instead to feign health problems and therefore remove themselves from PE classes as long as they possibly could. This led to them gaining a reputation as idle among the teachers at their college. And given that at such an age, the opinion that the educational establishment has of a student has a huge, tremendous bearing on their, like I said, future educational and employment prospects, we can see this as being a clear example of the way in which a student's attempts to exist in a system that was definitely not set up with them in mind could well have impinged on their ability to become fully participating members of the group who are responsible for generating social meanings, understanding social meanings, and maintaining social meanings. Like I said earlier, journalists, academics, lawyers, etc. So I would argue that yes, French genderqueer people are hermeneutically marginalised, or at least they are a group particularly vulnerable to the possibility of hermeneutical marginalisation. But so far, these remarks have been fairly general in that they may apply to anyone, anywhere else in the world. And actually, we've not yet demonstrated that this marginalisation leads to any sort of part of their social experience being obscured from general view. It could happen, after all, that while genderqueer people do not form a large part of the group responsible for the generation of social meanings, that all the hermeneutical resources they need are at their disposal anyway. And if we recall that hermeneutical injustice occurs only at the moment when a subject is trying to make sense of their social experience and find themselves unable to due to a lack in this hermeneutical resource, in this case that would not be enough to then claim an instance of hermeneutical injustice. So here I kind of want to leave people's sort of personal testimonies to one side for a second and just sort of highlight some aspects of the French language itself. French takes two grammatical genders, masculine and feminine, and that's really like the first lesson. You know, when you learn French at school, it's like le or la, and all the rest of the bump that comes with that. This gendered nature affects things like nouns, like I said, which are masculine or feminine, and pronouns. So, like English, French takes a different pronoun depending on the gender of the subject. In for men and L for women. But the behaviour of adjectives in French is also affected by the gender of the thing that the adjective is describing, whether that thing be animate or not. So if I were to be a happy guy, I would be heureux, and if I were to be a happy girl, I would be heureuse. So the difference in spelling, and therefore the difference in pronunciation, in a large number of cases, like the one I just highlighted, is much more than the thorn in the side of the student trying to learn French as a foreign language. For genderqueer people, particularly those identifying outside the binary, it becomes an impossible choice. A non-binary identified person cannot, in French, speak of themselves without making a choice to fall on either one side or the other of gender binary. And in the same way, a person cannot talk about another person without revealing their own conception of that person's gender. And like I said, that would be sort of binary, either masculine or feminine. So it's here that we can kind of see the obscurity of the non-binary French person's social experience in full technicolor, surround sound, whatever you want, because they are unable to utter a single sentence about themselves without first deciding which side of the binary they fall on. Something that for a lot of genderqueer people would be at best an irritating inconvenience, and at worst an entirely unfair and thoroughly irrelevant question. Not only are genderqueer people unable to express anything personal about themselves in a satisfactory way, they are, as we've noted, largely unable to access those areas where such an expression might gain some credibility in a wider sense. This then creates a situation whereby the hermeneutical lacuna, the gap in the hermeneutical resource, is maintained. A study by the sort of aforementioned trans activist research group, Chrysalide, found that a striking number of identities, the one that found that a striking number of identities among their 187 respondents, mentioned that for ease of representation, they recoded the open-ended identity markers as either mostly feminine or mostly masculine, finding after they'd done that the category of other made up only 2.1% of the respondents. So researchers kind of decided to leave that category out because any conclusions they could have drawn from that, I mean 2.1% is not statistically significant if you're talking about a huge group of you know, if you're talking about sort of masculine and feminine, the other recoded identities made up sort of almost half of masculine was almost half and feminine was almost half. So this is concerning, particularly given the testimony of Lowe, who is a non-binary identified person living in France, who's been quoted in another series of testimonials as saying, "Since the place of the masculine in society more accurately represents me than that of the feminine, and because you really have to choose, I am transitioning." So this means then that it is possible that the number of non-binary identified people might have been actually much higher than 2.1% in that particular study. But since both French society and French language is set up based on such a strict gender binary, these people have been forced into boxes that they don't necessarily feel like they fit into, and rather they feel like they've settled for something that is good enough. So, I mean, with the testimony of Lowe, they've sort of represented themselves as being, by and large, outside of the gender binary, but just because of the situation that they found themselves in, they've been forced to identify with kind of one or kind of the other, force themselves into a box that they actually don't feel represents them fully, but represents them in a way that they feel is just about good enough that they can kind of get on with their life. So I'm tempted to conclude then that while Fricker's conception of hermeneutical injustice as existing only at certain moments might be correct for some social types, and considering French non-binary people, it would be more appropriate to think of such an injustice as almost a constant state of being, because, like I said earlier, you just can't say a single sentence without declaring masculine or feminine. So the non-binary French person is faced with such an injustice every time they speak, or are spoken of, and therefore it becomes patently ridiculous to maintain that each utterance is itself a separate individual injustice. In this sense then, hermeneutical injustice is an integral part of what it means to be non-binary identified in France. And while it's kind of beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do here today, to sort of recommend any sort of great revolution of the French language, although maybe when I've got more time we can all do that. This bridge between the theoretical and practical aspects of hermeneutical injustice might provide a useful lens through which to consider the experiences of French genderqueer people.